Hi, I'm Stephen Carson, broadcasting to you live from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States. Welcome to Radical Liberation, a show I am increasingly proud of, and particularly excited to continue the series we started recently today, and we have a sense of where it's going to. So anyway, talk about that more in a minute. Real quick upfront stuff. The Discord hit 700 members. I'm excited about that. Thanks for everybody who's joined. And it's a great place to talk with folks who are like-minded, interested in the show, and talk about things that we don't feel we can talk about on YouTube, because YouTube has told us we don't want you to talk about those things on YouTube. So we have been having some interesting conversations. I'd love for you to join us. Must mention, Subscribestar, that's our primary way of getting support from you all. And most of the folks supporting us, almost all of them, send us $5 a month. So this is not like hopefully going to break the bank for you. But the support really matters, because as we get this show sort of more fancy with the production values and stuff, turns out it costs money. In particular, I am going to have to get a different machine, it looks like, a new machine to be a broadcasting machine. Haven't even figured out what machine that is, but I know it's going to cost more than we have. So your support is really appreciated. All right. Welcome to Ryan Turnipseed once again. Hello, sir. Uh-oh. He disappeared. Oh, there you are. Ryan?
How are you?
Okay. Yeah, your camera is acting wonky, but we can hear you just fine, so ignore that.
Okay.
Okay, so Road to Empire. Yeah, so I have dubbed this the Road to Empire series. What do I mean by that? I mean that we did a show with Tom DiLorenzo talking about Lincoln's real motivation for the invasion of the South, for the war between the states. And unlike the propaganda we've been given, it has a lot more to do with, well, money, benefiting from certain economic arrangements that would be forcibly shoved down everyone's throats. Stop me, Ryan, if I say anything you think is historically inaccurate.
It's all correct so far.
Okay. So we talked about that, and then having established this American system that Lincoln was really motivated by, that goes back to, these ideas go back to Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton and Clay. Having established that Lincoln was essentially putting those ideas into effect, we talked about the Reconstruction, where we saw those ideas put into effect to the south in the conquered southern states, with horrible, long-lasting effects, by the way. I think that's worth highlighting. We touched on it briefly when we talked about Reconstruction, but the effects of the war and of the subsequent Reconstruction weren't over in a decade or two. One could argue they're not over now. Ryan?
Very correct, yes. And that's why it's such a important topic, is because you can still see the effects of it today. It's very applicable across the nation, in fact.
Right, and so it'd be nice if we could put it this way, Ryan, which is that having done their number on the South, they then turn to the West. But I think that's not quite right. As you'll tell us, I think that the story we're going to tell today overlaps in time with what was happening in the South after the war, right?
Just slightly.
Oh, okay.
You can see they really, and it's better put, they really intensified their efforts after they got the South firmly under their boot.
Okay. And so what we're going to turn to now is that the Union, having conquered the South, having, well, reconstructed the South, which is a complicated story, which was told at length in a previous recent episode, um, now turns its attention to the West, um, where they have various plans, which we'll talk about, having to do with land deals and building railroads and all kinds of various ways in which they were going to extend this, how do I put it? Big business, big government partnership. Would that be a reasonable
Yeah,
characterization of the
yeah, and it
American
gets a lot
system?
more. Yeah, and it will get a lot more sinister as it deals with the natives in the West.
Right, and they're going to extend this now to the West. There's just one tiny problem, or you could say a set of problems, which is that there's some people there already. I think you'll probably get into this. Some of them had been living in those very places for, well, as long as anyone could remember. Others, I think, probably had been displaced.
Yep.
Right? They were natives who had been in
Yes.
the East and had
Yes.
moved to the West and were more recent. They were native to the Americas, but not necessarily native to Colorado or whatever. Right?
Yeah, or Montana or Wyoming or wherever. A lot of displacement kind of just kicked the can down the road.
Right, right. Pushed them over, but now you had Americans in California, and you had this uh, movement into the West, and now you get the natives getting squeezed, and they can't simply just keep moving away from the United States, right? Now they're kind of getting squeezed from both
Yep.
sides, and they're stuck in the middle between uh, a more populated California and, of course, the East that continues to grow towards them. Am I getting the big picture kind of right there?
Yep, and add in railroads, and it doesn't really matter where they're coming from at that point. They just are.
Right. Okay. So, anything else to say before we jump into the slides, Ryan?
Not that I can think of right now.
Okay, except let me just be right up front. I said we're unleashing Ryan. That was my spin on the fact that Ryan knows what he's talking about on this topic, and I'm learning today. But that is a valid thing. I'm always learning with the show. I just usually try to do more of the learning before I'm live on air. Today it's going to be live on air, so I'll just tell you that up front. It's going to be starring Ryan today. So let's go into it.
Alrighty.
Okay,
So,
war in the West. Go ahead, sir.
So this is it's characterized in history as a series of wars. You can call it the one big category, the Indian Wars. It's better to put it as like it is a category. So inside the Indian Wars, you have a list of probably 70 or so small scale wars. That we aren't going to be going over today because we're not a history podcast. We're more concerned with the effects of what happened, the economic impact, the impact on the people, and kind of what happened afterwards. The part where you don't learn in your history class. But to do that, we're going to need the background, which should be our next slide.
Okay, there we go. Go ahead.
All right. So, contact with natives started immediately whenever colonization started. And that's across the entire continent as well. Very rarely do we have a situation like what happened with Cape Town, where there were very few, if any, natives present there. Most places had someone that would turn up that claimed ownership to that land just at some point in time that the colonists came into contact with. We'll get into who actually owns land and stuff like that later, but this has been going on since Columbus turned up and spread the knowledge of the New World to the Old World. So what this was, it was a blend of peaceful contact and hostile contact depending on the tribe. So there were multiple different tribes in the Americas. They were very different based on tribes. just like you wouldn't, you might call someone uneducated for generalizing about Europeans. The English are not the same thing as the Romanians, for instance. The same logic kind of applies for this. So some contact was very hostile. Some tribes were militaristic. They tended to get wiped out very quickly because they had bows and arrows and the colonists had gunpowder. Some contact was entirely friendly, and most contact was somewhere in between. And that was the vast majority of it. So, trading, proselytization, missionary work, and the colonists developing the natives, these were the common actions. Different empires had different policies for different natives. Trading was popular among all of them, and that's the one that the United States inherited. But the United States also inherited a drive to Christianize, which sometimes wasn't present in some of the colonial empires. And this is a ethos that's going to carry throughout the West as we move on. So, zooming in just a little bit, because that's a lot of generalization, there was the Cherokee tribes, or the Cherokee tribe, rather, was very adaptive to what the colonists brought to them. Before contact, they had no writing system. They were using bows and arrows. Farming was relatively ineffective. After contact, they developed a written alphabet. It's very recent. We have a record of its actual development. They adopted Christianity. They adopted monogamous marriage, which was seen as kind of like the litmus test for are you civilized or not at the time, and still is to this day for most people. And just to kind of prove to the colonists how civilized they were, they began participating in the slave trade and started to purchase African slaves. We find that morally wrong now. Back then, since they were in the south of the U.S., it was kind of seen as like a status symbol, and they were very keen on assimilating. This is the Cherokee. However, 4 other tribes followed this trajectory. We'll see in the next slide. We have 5 tribes in total. The aforementioned Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole. They are still in the southeast of the United States, Florida, Alabama, Georgia. Like, that's the kind of main areas that they are inhabiting. And they were kind of seen as their own nations. Like, they could make their own laws, they had their own courts, they had their own policies. I don't know about taxation right off the top of my head. And as we mentioned earlier, they had their own writing systems. So these were kind of like mini states within the United States.
So were these were it's because these particular 5 tribes were in a different state of development. I mean, that's a prejudicial word, but you know what I mean. They were sort of organized differently really prior to the Europeans arriving in the first place, or did it have something to do with...
Yes.
Go ahead.
So a lot of these 5 tribes were in particular much closer knit than the other tribes were. If you read Native history, most of the time it's oral tradition. Other tribes kind of in the west or in the north would often, we would call it civil war with each other. They weren't these 5 tribes, however, had a very strong identity, which allowed them to kind of develop a lot quicker than the ones up north who were constantly warring with each other. Did that make sense?
So that's interesting. So they had civilizational, or, how do I put it? They had behaviors as a tribe that I guess, I don't know if they were out competing the tribes before the Europeans were around, but at least once the Europeans were around, they had advantages because of the way they functioned in terms of dealing with the Europeans, right?
Yes, and yes, exactly. And they were these tribes were the most open to trading with the Europeans, but they also, as I said before, kept their language. They kept their homelands for quite a while. Believe, if I remember correctly, that the Cherokee even developed their own architectural style while they were still within the Southeast for a short period of time. So they adopted European technology, but they kept most of the core of what they were beforehand. So they assimilated other tribes, they secured their independence, and they continued to develop.
So they
until
had some kind of combination of
Jackson.
They had some kind of combination of cultural strength, but also combined with the ability to be a little open so that they could benefit from the Europeans, right?
Yes, that's exactly how it worked.
Real quick before you bring in Jackson, the Seminole, are those the ones that would be in like Alligator Alley in Florida?
Yes, these were the ones that, and we'll get to this. They fought multiple wars in Florida.
Well, the reason I ask is they're still there, right?
Were very good guerrilla fighters, but they do get relocated, and we'll get to that.
Okay.
Some of them
the reason I bring it up, Ryan,
because they were part.
We met it. I was born in South Florida, so I was back there and going through Alligator Alley, and we stopped at one of these tourist places. So I was meeting some Indians at that time, and I couldn't remember the tribe, but they were Seminole. Sounds right to me.
Yep. Yeah, that would be what they are.
Okay.
So, yeah, we'll get to how they worked because they're the special case here. So, we have these 5 tribes in the southeast of the United States. The southeast of the United States is very wealthy, in terms of land quality, in terms of minerals, in terms of lumber and forests, rivers, coastal line. It's essentially perfect for settling. However, there are natives that people coming in. Most of them are newer waves of immigrants. This coincides with the time where we start getting like our first real wave of immigration now that the United States is independent. Andrew Jackson gets elected on a platform of a hadn't been seen before populism. And one of his populist policies for the American citizenry at the time, remember, separate thing, the Indians are their own thing, the U.S. citizens are the colonists. His populist policy was that he would force the natives west of the Mississippi, give the land to the colonists that were in the southeast, and it was kind of brought with a tagline that now that the natives are west of the Mississippi, it'll be safer for them as well, because now they won't have to fight for their land, and he came up with a long list of justifications, but so it was presented as like a good deal for both sides.
Okay, real quick, just to get us starting to be located in time here. Andrew Jackson is president from 1829 to 1837. So this is about 30 years before the war between the states. And you're saying he goes on a program to kick them over to the west of Mississippi. Yep.
And we're not going to spend too much more time on this. It's just kind of what you need to know to not be lost.
Is this the Trail of Tears stuff?
About that that's we'll get to that. So Andrew Jackson does a lot of this by all branches of government. Some of it's by executive order. The legislative branch backs him, and the Supreme Court goes a step further and supports all of this, but they also rule that Indians can't legally hold titles to land. So, how do you legally justify forcing people off their land without paying them the fair compensation that's in the Constitution? Well, this group of people just can't own it. So they never had it to begin with, so we don't even need to pay them for it. This is what the Supreme Court came up with. This was very unpopular with the natives, and it caused multiple wars. Most notably, the Seminole in Florida put up fights, I think 3 times in total. They were called the Seminole Wars, and they managed to beat back the United States government until about the 1850s or so. the
Wow.
ones that decided to stay. So they held out quite a long time, and they have had a legacy since the European colonists turned up of being kind of like the star guerrilla fighters of the United States. They were adept at hiding in swamps, adept at hiding in the forests. They were very good marksmen, and they could kind of just it's kind of like our Vietnam, if you will. They were very good at just kind of fighting against organized militaries. So the relocation and the multiple wars would end up costing Jackson between $80 million and $100 million at the time, exceedingly expensive. Being as we're in the second generation of the United States and we're already spending hundreds of millions of dollars on warfare.
Yeah.
So this also set a precedent where the president would directly enforce Indian location, and he would also enforce a reservation system. So if we go to the next slide, it'll kind of give you like a sort of like a geographical indicator of what we're talking about here.
Right, so this is with
so you can see
the
most of
colored
them.
the colored arrows, right? Am I on the right thing?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So each of those colored arrows are the one of the 5 tribes. So the Seminole, you can see down there in the bottom right, or Florida, they are the red line. The route was they would get forced out of Florida, dropped off in New Orleans, and then they would have to hike up through Arkansas and into the Indian Territory. The rest of them had to go on land. Some of them traveled the Mississippi. This was government organized, and it was helped along, which is a euphemism. It was helped along by the U.S. military. So there were supply shortages. It was very rough. There was a lot of incidences of people just getting shot. This is one of the first instances where the United States government planned something and it ended up just not working at all. And this is like a classic case study of a government trying to plan something and then having supply shortages and massive resistance because it's unpopular. That's part of that. That's why this is significant in bringing up. It's a supply problem. So if we go to the next slide, we can see kind of how the
real quick, Ryan, while we're still on the slide, what was the support of the Americans, the European Americans, for this? Was everybody totally on board?
So the people in the States were largely on board, the ones that could vote at least, because they were the landowners. And those dark green areas, which is where they were being forced off of, the natives, they had been mostly untapped because the way these tribes operated, they didn't exactly cut down forest for farmland. They kind of they were willing to hamper their productive output to preserve their land.
Yeah.
So that kept these the natural resources very attractive.
I see.
So the people down there, it was very popular with them. In the Northeast, however, the Whig Party hated this. It's one of the things that the Whigs got right, in my opinion.
Yeah.
They were very against this, and they viewed it as violating multiple treaties that had been made with these tribes. They viewed it as a violation of natural rights, and they viewed it as just overall like a potentially catastrophic policy that would cause more warfare.
Okay.
They're right on all of those fronts, but Jackson held a majority, so this is what happened.
Okay, next slide.
That's your support.
All right, now we've got a map of the whole continent.
This is kind of how the U.S. is divided up. Yeah, so those kind of yellow and green dots in the map, you can see Oklahoma is basically a giant. These are reservations. Oklahoma is Indian territory. The whole thing's just kind of we have natives? Well, just throw them in the Indian territory and we don't have to worry about them. However, if you're in Oregon or northern Montana, it's really difficult to get to Oklahoma. So they kind of just make reservations there. Reservations, for those that don't know, are places that the U.S. government forced the Native Americans, the natives, onto after they had been relocated from their previous home. So those 5 civilized tribes, they were forced onto reservations in Oklahoma, and that was where they were forced to live by law. It was illegal for them to really live anywhere else as a tribe, and there were a lot of other regulations around them to where they were basically forced there until the government just decided to let them go, and that rarely, if ever, happened. So, how is this legal? So, the Supreme Court justified the movement. How do you justify keeping them there legally? Well, Congress passed something called the Indian Appropriations Act. This is where we get legally organizing these reservations, and this is where we also get Indian removal kind of spreading from the south to the Great Lakes region in the northwest. So a lot of these tribes weren't forced into Oklahoma, they were just forced west of the Mississippi up there. This is going to cause problems later, just a bit of foreshadowing. So, with all that out of the way, I think we're ready for immediately proceed.
It says preceding today's
Civil War.
topic.
That's kind of just basic information. Next slide. So immediately. So in this time frame, there were gold rushes, and once again, it wasn't all conflict, it wasn't all peace. If someone tells you it's one or the other, they're trying to sell you a narrative. It's neither true. So some natives along the trails were very peaceful and trading. Some natives along the trails were very hostile and shot on sight. Just how it is. Different tribes act differently. So with California, there were a lot of natives there previously. The U.S. government wasn't there to restore glorious order as it will later, and we'll get to how that looks. Settlers had to deal with the natives themselves in California. So how this worked was quite often they would just make their own independent agreements and treat them like anyone else. And if the tribe was very hostile and just attacked them, then they would defend themselves and attack back. So the problems in California basically sorted themselves out, and you don't really hear about them being a major issue because they were sorted out, as they usually are on the local level. In Utah, they had natives there as well. Mormon colonists were famously hostile towards anyone living there previously, because what would happen is the Mormons think that the Native Americans are one of the lost tribes of Israel. They would go and try to proselytize to them and say that they've brought like the missing part of their religion. The natives wouldn't accept it. The Mormons would get angry, tensions would heat up, and then you would have wars. Just kind of like the general trend with how the Mormons treated the natives, and it led to a lot of warfare. So the Mormons ended up basically kicking the natives out of Utah, the more hostile way. So you don't hear about the natives of Utah because they were dealt with quite barbarically by the Mormons. Later on, when the Mormon state of Utah becomes a state in the U.S., the state government petitioned the federal government to pay for their debts that they had incurred by warring with the natives, and the federal government just gave them what they asked for, which was $1.5 million. And that was in pensions, that was just in direct reimbursement. Part of it went to infrastructure that was destroyed by the warfare. So the Mormons had a policy of shoot now, ask the government for money later, and we'll take the land. And here we can see the settlers themselves have different approaches. California went much smoother. Utah went much more, had much more friction. Making sense so far?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, oh, they're saying, okay, wait a second. Chad is saying that your audio is breaking up. I was hearing it, but I didn't know if that was just the way I'm hearing you. See, I would expect at college you would have really good internet, so I'm a little surprised.
How bad is
Yeah, let me ask.
I think we might be in the middle of a rainstorm.
Okay, well, let's just proceed, and I've asked the chat to tell us how it's going. Okay, so
Okay.
oh yeah, so I just wanted to on the topic of the Mormons very briefly. I didn't know much about them. I They used to be in Missouri, as if you know the history of the Mormons, and they aren't anymore, shall we say? Uh, or they got kind of booted. But anyway, so I didn't really grow up knowing Mormons that I recall. So there's just um, the Marie and Donny Osmond or something like that. You know, like there were basically some famous people I knew were Mormons, and that's pretty
Hmm.
much what I knew. Um, so it sort of came as a shock coming in
I
really
see.
naive to be reading Sherlock Holmes. I really enjoyed Sherlock Holmes. And so I decided to just read everything that Arthur
Hmm.
Conan Doyle wrote about Sherlock Holmes. So I read all the stories, all the novels.
Yeah.
Well, one of them is the origin story of Sherlock Holmes, basically. Or I guess you could say the origin story of the relationship between Dr. Watson and Holmes. And that is called A Study in Scarlet. And it has a structure that he uses in a couple other of his novels, where the first half is Watson and Holmes solving a mystery. And then the second half is a flashback to what led up to the crime that Sherlock and Holmes, Sherlock and Watson end up trying to solve. So the second half of A Study in Scarlet is about the Mormons coming to Utah. It's a fictionalized account,
Yeah.
but let's just put it this way: if Conan Doyle had his history right at all, then it is a brutal portrait of the early Mormon settlers. It is not a complimentary picture of the Mormons at all. What you just said about the way they treated the Indians fits with what I learned reading Conan Doyle's depiction of the Mormons. So anyway,
Yeah. If you want a grim account of the settling of the West, the Mormons, it was that it's a pretty dark account. There's people dying of starvation because the land's a desert. You have a conflict because they're polygamous. They have natives that they're generally hostile towards. It's basically living in like an apocalypse setting. But
right.
anyways,
Yeah.
so
Okay. Next slide yet?
conflicts with settlers, kind of, almost.
Okay. I'll
Conflicts
wait.
with settlers really increased when the transcontinental railroads came into being, because now it was a lot cheaper and a lot faster to get from the east or the west coast to the interior. So all the things that I just mentioned, amplify them by about 100 or so, and that's kind of what we're at. You have everyone coming: veterans, people who lost everything in the Civil War. You have opportunists, gold miners, everyone. So, with that, we're back at where we left off, kind of, with the last show, which is the next slide: Grant's peace
Okay.
policy.
Go ahead. Yep.
Ready? Alrighty. So, Ulysses S. Grant, kind of one of his tasks with a country that's been half occupied was presenting himself as a peacemaker. He didn't want to be known as the war president. His past didn't help him, considering he was a general. So he declared, by his own words, that he is going to pursue a peace policy with the natives in the West. So he he made a federal organization that would deal with natives. He reformed the way that the government would interact with them. Previously, the federal government would appoint what was called an Indian agent, and they would be kind of like the line of communication to the tribes. Now it's basically that, but there's a bureaucracy behind it. He thought that would work more efficiently. We'll find out if it does really quickly. So he wanted a lot of money to spend on natives, just for just about everything that the federal government would want to spend on someone. So the radicals in Congress, they were, if you remember from the start of the last show, I believe I mentioned that they were very kind of radically Protestant. This is right up their alley because they are really big into proselytizing to the natives. So they granted just about everything that Ulysses S. Grant asked for, kind of as like a virtue signal. he appointed a half-native known as Eli S. Parker as his Commissioner of Indian Affairs. That means nothing because he's from one tribe and there's about 200 something of them out in the West. So it looked good in politics back in Washington. So the ultimate goal for the radicals, like they did with everyone in the United States at the time, was to get citizenship to the natives. They did the same thing with the freed slaves. They restricted the South from doing it because they thought that they would go against their political plans and their economic plans. But now they want to give the natives political citizenship and completely integrate them into the United States. So to do this, they relied heavily on support from missionaries and industrial magnates, and it was very popular in the North and the Northeast. So it's an election strategy. It looks good. They have complete and total power over the legislature. So here's what they did. Those 5 civilized tribes from earlier, the ones in Oklahoma, they sent out delegates from each of those into the West to teach the natives how to farm in hopes that they would stop being hunter-gatherers and kind of join into a more sedentary lifestyle where they are at one point on the map and easier to deal with. This didn't work because most of these natives had never even heard of a Cherokee, let alone anything that they had to do with. It's about as effective as sending a pale Arab into Russia to teach them something because they look similar. There's going to be a lot of clash there, and clash there was. This did not work at all. So
wait, let me make sure I'm getting this, Ryan. This was basically, we wish all the tribes were like the 5 civilized tribes. I mean, that's basically what they wanted.
Yeah.
Got it. But it didn't work.
Yep, that was exactly what they wanted.
Yeah.
Correct. Because, like, that's like taking someone from the Amazon and sending them out into, like, northern India and expecting them to get along. It didn't happen. So, and here's something you might find interesting, kind of like as a precursor to the Progressive era. Grant's rhetoric in dealing with the natives used a lot of, it referred a lot to progress and a lot to civilizing, which is something, if you've read the Progressives, it's a motif. It's something they bring up constantly. This is the precursor. So, in the next slide, we'll kind of zoom in our scope, and we'll see how this worked practically.
Okay, reservation organization. Go ahead.
Yes. So, Grant he broke a few laws here, but I'm not joking when I say this. The way he got around doing what he's about to do, he just didn't talk to the people that would be concerned over it, and they never found out, so he was never, it was never brought up. So how these reservations were organized, Grant gave each of the denominations that he cared about varying numbers of reservations to just manage. So the Quakers received 16 reservations. The Methodists received 14 reservations. The Presbyterians received 9. The Anglicans received 8. The Roman Catholics received 7. And I might add, these were the ones that typically did the best because the Roman Catholics have been doing this a lot. The Baptists received 5. The Dutch Reformed received 5. The Congregationalists received 3. The Unitarians received 2. And the Lutherans received 1. So, you might ask, how does this coincide with freedom of religion? Because now the federal government is forcing this denomination onto this particular group, and this particular group cannot legally leave these reservations. How did Grant get past this? He did not get into contact with his Secretary of State before doing this, and the Secretary never found out, so it never was an issue. That's literally how he got around this.
I was going to say, I understand with the Unitarians because they're barely a religion anyway, but still, yeah.
With these denominations, they're all working within the same federal agency, and they are working as the denomination. It's not like some flavor that you see in a congressman today. The Baptists are influencing policy alongside the Roman Catholics and the Quakers. It didn't work well. They couldn't agree on anything, and largely they kind of went their own separate ways, and they started to resemble the missions of the Roman Catholics in the 1500s. So basically what Grant did here was he kind of just drew on a map which denomination got what land, and that's what happened. It wasn't effective at peace because they couldn't agree on anything, and this caused a lot of conflict. It's that simple. So the administration, the bureaucracy behind this, not the reservation, just the bureaucracy, this new agency, it was just given $2 million a year, and adding on to the expenses, this is pretty big. Once again, we're not yet into the era where you just add zeros onto things and you throw them out into Congress and they'll vote on it. These denominations and the natives are now getting $2 million a year, and Ulysses S. Grant is basically deciding what goes where. It's a lot of resources to work with at the time. So, how is he going to work with it? Grant issued multiple executive orders, and these orders were literally him writing, "I have the power to do this with the natives." And he just did this for a variety of reasons, and by the end of it, he himself was basically kind of like the dictator of all these native tribes. He was the final authority. He determined their laws. He determined the legality of things. He determined what money went where. He was the arbiter and the dictator. And then, well, he gets out of office eventually, so then whoever's after him, the president, is going to have the same power. So he interfered with commerce. He set taxes. He regulated land. He himself, this isn't some committee, Grant himself was regulating land purchases for tribes. He was regulating how tribes could organize, what kind of government they could have, and he set limits on to how much they could meet. So they aren't citizens. The Supreme Court said they're technically their own nation still, so the Constitution isn't applying here, in case you were wondering. So the federal government mandated that the natives had to drop their nomadic lifestyle and learn agriculture, and they also had to become Christian. And on top of that, something that we might find particularly insidious, Grant mandated that each tribal organization could not be as it traditionally was. It had to be a representative and constitutional government. So it's very insidious. There's much more on this. There are, I was in my university library the other day, and the 5th floor is just archives. There's a whole bookshelf of things that just came out of the reservation system, and most of it was kind of from this era, and then the other side was like 1930 to the modern day. There are books of just records on it. That's not even interpretation, just the numbers, the orders. So it was a very intrusive administration.
So stop me if I'm being anachronistic, but this sounds like bringing democracy, right? Like later on we have the global democratic revolution more recently under George W. Bush and stuff. This sounds like there was a flavor of that back then. We're going to bring democracy to the natives, and they're going to learn how to do government like we do government, right?
Yeah, so if you don't know about the progressive movement in the United States, the one from 1890 to about 1920 or so, a lot of those major figures got their start. A lot of those major figures in the progressive movement got their start with dealing with natives. They were a social cause, rather, and a lot of the policies that we're about to see come directly from progressive figures. So this precedes them, but it informs their opinion about spreading democracy. So the progressives believed in bringing national democracy to just about everywhere in the world that the United States was. They ripped that directly from Ulysses S. Grant, mandating that each native organization had to be representative and constitutional.
Okay.
So you're not being anachronistic. This
really
is literally the root of all of
that
that.
really got my attention. You're saying that some of the key progressive figures, once these policies start being implemented for in the United States itself, they gain some of their
Mhm.
experience implementing these policies among the native tribes.
Implementing, studying, writing the laws back in Washington. Yeah, they were involved in some way or another. They didn't have to be out there
Oh, I see.
necessarily
I
in the
see. Hmm.
reservations enforcing, but they were heavily involved in all of this. And
Right.
it's a feedback loop. So some of them they make the ideas and implement them later on, and a lot of the ideas that were already there from Grant and the radicals informs their opinions on other things in the world at the time. So
And
this is kind of like the core of all of it.
and don't answer this now because I think you'll be answering it as we go. But don't feel the need to answer it now. I assume that the marvelous successes of progressive planning for the natives and bringing democracy to them is why the progressives then were in the position to have their policies enforced on everybody, right?
We'll
We'll
get
get
there.
there. Okay.
Yeah. So, this reservation system doesn't sound good to anyone. Like it sounds pretty terrible, and it was. And this is how the natives saw it. So the United States basically came over, the federal government, not the settlers. Remember, the settlers were happy to deal with things on their own. The federal government's now coming with the American flag and telling the natives, this is what we're going to do with you. Get ready. Some of the natives they mostly had horses and guns now. They thought, and they did put up resistance to this. So if you go to the next slide, we'll see a map, and in
Yes.
red are going to be all of the different conflicts that happen, and in black, I know it's hard to see on a small screen, and it's not that high of resolution anyways. It's just kind of like a marker of kind of just the scale of all of this. Red are the battles between the U.S. government and the natives. Black are the different outposts that the U.S. government created in order to keep order.
Okay.
So it's everywhere. Notice in California, hardly anything because they handled it on their own before the federal government decided to take care of them.
Got it.
Utah, nothing in there because of the reasons that we mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Everywhere else, though, now the federal government's involved, it's a lot messier. So, the natives, some of them hadn't seen combat, actual organized combat before with a large army. They didn't fare well. Like, they had guns, they had horses, but they just hadn't seen combat like this before.
Right.
So this ended in what a lot of historians call massacres. It can be misleading because a lot of the times the natives started the altercation,
Mm-hmm.
but the United States government responded with basically force that you would see in the Civil War. There's a disbalance of force there.
Yeah.
And this makes it look like a massacre. Like it doesn't look good, and it's not even popular back home. Like the U.S. Army they look like a bunch of madmen out in the West.
So,
The most
speaking
yeah.
of the veteran, who had veterans and who didn't. So you're saying, yeah, a number of these tribes, they literally just didn't have combat veterans. They'd been doing their thing relatively peacefully, I guess. I mean, the tribes fought among themselves, so I don't think it'd be fair to say that there was zero violence, right? But they weren't doing maybe pitched wars, right? But on the other side,
I doubt most of them.
On the other side,
Sorry, go on.
you had veterans of the war between the states, I assume. Now, I'm sure there were younger soldiers who were new, but the officers, at least, probably were combat veterans from the war, right?
Yeah, we'll get there. We'll see some famous names here in a minute.
Okay.
But what I was meaning was like a lot of native combat is hit and run tactics on horseback with like a rifle.
Yeah.
Most of them hadn't even seen an artillery gun before. Most of them hadn't seen like a lot of the supply depots that the U.S. Army was operating under. Like there's just kind of like an imbalance here of organization, and you can't import organization. You kind of have to learn it. Well, we're dealing with one army that just got out of the civil uh, nomadic life. One's not perfect and the other isn't shine their different points winning. The most notable example is Sand Creek. I believe it was the Cheyenne, and it's not the main top point of the show. The Cheyenne Indians against the U.S. Army, and the U.S. Army responded with artillery fire, and they torched the whole camp because that was civil
I'm sorry. For me,
they
at
torched
least,
the whole
for
camp.
me at least,
Natives lost
you're
about
dropping out pretty
20 or
heavily
so.
just now. So you're saying the Battle of Sand Creek,
Oh,
right?
yes.
And
Yes.
what happened to the Cheyennes?
Can-
They used artillery on them, and they were pretty much wiped out.
Yeah, they torched the camp, the Cheyenne camp, because that was Civil War tactics,
Uh-huh.
and they killed a lot of the women, children, and elderly. It did not look good back home,
Oh wow.
but the Cheyenne were dealt with. So
Wow.
that's just kind of what we're dealing with here. That's the extreme example. You see a lot of this on a smaller scale elsewhere. And we'll get to the flip side later. The U.S.
So-
Army wasn't just taking big victories; they lost
Yeah.
a few things as well.
Okay, so real quick though, I am finding it interesting that this is not being done in isolation. There is news getting back to the east, and in some
Yep.
cases, people are not very happy with what they're hearing. It sounds like, right?
Yeah, most
Okay.
cases, because the way this is getting published. Ooh, can
Yeah,
you hear me
yeah.
all
Go
right?
ahead.
Okay, good. The way this is working, you have newspapers back in the east or the west sending their kind of like field reporters out. The field reporters will take notes on everything that's happening. They'll send it back to the office, and it'll be taken by mail, now on train, back to whichever coast they're from. So there is a delay, but it is getting very heavily published.
Mm.
We're clearing out the West for you. But the way that the newspapers were reporting it was kind of more detail and less narrative, for once in United States history. And they were kind of just saying, here's the casualties from these battles. Here's who lost what. Here's how the events happened from what I saw. And what the public was seeing was the United States was taking artillery guns into nomadic groups and torching their villages whenever they were out fighting and killing anyone that they could find. Did not look good. No one liked it. It was not popular with any major voting bloc in the country. Wasn't big of a deal because there were other things going on at this time. And the time period's like 1860 to 1875 here is kind of what we're dealing with.
The story you're telling is reminding me a little bit of what I hear from people who are critical of current modern day American police, which is that you have people coming back from the empire. Well, kind of two flows at least from the U.S. empire. You have people who are military veterans, and so they're trained to act like, you know, soldiers, and now they're supposed to be being police, and it may be some people may think this sounds weird,
Right.
but soldiers and police actually aren't supposed to act exactly the same way. So you know, you have that issue, and then my understanding is you literally just have a flow of equipment, so that, you know, when I was young, a policeman did not look like a military figure. He did not have like body
Right.
armor, you know, right? And now more and more often you see domestic police that look more like soldiers. in terms of the equipment they're carrying,
Yeah.
the weaponry they're using, and so forth. So you hopefully you see the parallel I'm making, which is that you've got people who were
Yes, I
trained
do.
in what everyone acknowledges was an absolutely brutal war, the war between the states. And now, hey, go deal with these, uh, little tribes of people with their women folk and their babies and so forth, with your artillery, etc. Right? So it sounds like that's part of
Yeah.
you've got kind of the wrong type of training for what they're supposed to be doing here, right?
Exactly. Yes, and in all fairness, there isn't much. There isn't a different group of people that the federal government can really draw upon to fight these wars. It is very difficult to find someone interested in the military at this point in time that did not fight in the Civil War, and all of the officers did. Like we're still early enough out of the Civil War that there's not really an established officer that didn't witness the Civil War. So, in fairness to them, it wasn't like they looked at all of their options and said, let's go with the most brutal one, but it was the only one available to them. It's what they ended up doing. And the moral argument should really lie with should they have done it and not what extent should they have done it. So, like, that's kind of what we're working with here. I don't want to paint the picture that most lefties will when doing this, when saying, like, they treated it so badly and they could have done all this other stuff. Well, they didn't really have much else. The real question is, should they have been doing it? And
Right.
we'll get
Yeah.
into that. That'll be at the end. So, back to the map. You see, it's not looking too peaceful. And if you're thinking that or inferred that, you're very correct. This is kind of where we get the Wild West stereotype from. It's not from settling the West. It's from the army's adventures fighting natives. So government against natives. Go figure. The government ruins this again. But this is kind of where you get that stereotype from, like the violent Wild West. Well, for most people, it wasn't violent. For the U.S. Army, it was because they were being sent to war, really. So, how this worked, though, the U.S. Army was used to fighting the Confederates, or if they were Confederate and joined the Army again, they were used to fighting Union soldiers. It wasn't all just one giant stomp where the U.S. Army turned up and extinguished any resistance. It turns out those really fast hit-and-run maneuvers that the native cavalrymen can do was really effective at disrupting supply lines and at kind of destroying conventional infantry organization. So there were some cases where the U.S. Army found itself outclassed, and the natives, being as they themselves had previously fought the Federal Army, or the U.S. Army rather, the natives could actually win battles. I have an anecdote of this. I believe it was the Sioux. They pioneered a method so when the U.S. Army would line up their infantrymen into a line and fire, because that's kind of the tactics they were still using at this point.
Mm-hmm.
It was a Sioux strategy that you start at one end of the line with a horse and ride as fast as possible across as you can. And by the time the infantry fire, they will have missed you. And then everyone else, the rest of your guys, can come in and attack the infantry while they're still reloading.
Right.
I forget the specific name of the strategy. And it was quite daring because, it's very easy for that to go wrong.
Yep.
But when it worked, the U.S. Army found itself outclassed, and they usually just lost the battle completely and all their equipment there. Because when your infantry are completely done, and that's all you have, and now the native cavalry are coming up the top, it's over. That you're not going to win that, and this is what happened. So, this is kind of what you're dealing with here. It's very bloody. There's a lot of guerrilla warfare. So whenever the U.S. Army went to any mountainous region, any desert, or any forest, this is where you see really high casualties in terms of supplies and starvation or disease, but also in terms of battle, because the U.S. Army is used to fighting in the east, where there's grassland and rivers and forests and sea line and roads. There's none of that out here. The natives are used to the land. They typically do better. However, out of all of this, Yeah.
Oh, just real quick. What it's hard to
Say
see as you know, the actual text on the map. Can you just give us a range
right.
of the there's years on these battles. What what is the I mean, you could look at the earliest and the latest, but more interesting is when are the bulk of these battles roughly?
The bulk of these battles are going to be kind of like 1866 to about 1870 or so.
Oh,
That's
really?
when you get the majority of it.
Okay, so it is. Well, wait, that's what I said earlier, and I thought you disagreed. So it is really just
Well,
after the war between the states, right?
yeah, yeah, but that's the majority,
Hmm.
greater than 50%. There is a good chunk of it that is 1850, 1862. You know,
Hmm. Okay.
like especially some of the closer you get to the Mississippi or the closer you get to the Pacific, they're going to be earlier.
Okay.
So the reason that I disagreed with you was just so that I was we can't be knocked on for saying that all of this happened immediately after the Civil War. There was lead up. It's intensifying after the Civil
Yeah,
War
I
is how
see.
I
Okay.
described it.
Right. 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 It's sort of
Yeah,
it
because
peaks right after the war for the several years after the war between the states, but there's battles before and there's
mhm,
battles after that period.
yep,
Yeah. Okay. Got
exactly.
it.
Yes.
Got it.
So, um, so when the natives eventually lose this, because honestly, here there's no way you can win if you're a tribe and the U.S. government has just declared war on you. You're going to lose or you're going to flee.
Right.
There was a couple of tribes. The Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce, if I remember correctly, was famous for just going up into Canada and leaving. Uh, I believe that was him. So some fled, but the ones that stayed and accepted defeat and the terms of the U.S. government, they were forced onto those reservations that I mentioned earlier, and a lot of their possessions were confiscated, and everything that they now had, not owned, but just had at their disposal, was provided by the federal government. Um, so most of the natives are now on these reservations. The government's providing for them in quotes because we all know what government provision looks like. It kind of looks like a absence of rather than an action. Um, it's not working too well. And there was a group or a tribe rather called the Modoc that when they were on their reservations, they saw how terrible it was. Their strategy was just to up and leave and return back to their homeland in Oregon. So one, I'm not joking. They just left the reservation one day, went back to their homeland, and tried to force off the new settlers that had been awarded the land by the U.S. government. Um, this didn't work. It wasn't bloody. Like there were a couple of losses on each side, and they were eventually forced back. So
I'm sorry.
it's a very
Should I
fluid
be on the
system.
Modoc Wars slide?
Oh yeah, sorry,
Okay.
sorry. Yeah,
There we go. Or I'm
I
sorry,
forgot
Modoc?
to
I've never
mention that.
heard this term before.
Yeah,
Modoc.
yeah. There's if you like I said at the beginning, if you look at just the actual numbers of named wars under the Indian Wars, they're all named after tribes, and there are maybe 50 or so that you and I have never heard of. This is just notable because this is one of the few groups where the whole tribe just left the reservation and went back home,
Hmm.
and then were forced back. But
Hmm.
like
Hmm.
this was tried. Um, so it's not like they're being forced into prison compounds where you have giant walls and turrets keeping you in, but they are stuck there. Like
Yeah.
they did try to leave. It wasn't just a lack of willpower that kept them there. Um,
Right.
so in the next slide,
Okay.
we will see that they're after so this tribe leaving the reservations and multiple new gold discoveries in the north, it's going to cause another surge in conflict. So
Hmm.
after the Civil War, we get like the main surge of conflict in terms of battles. This is kind of one that's going to be similar, but not quite as much. So the Modoc left their reservation. Other tribes heard about this. It wasn't just isolated, and it kind of inspired a sense of insurrection, if you will, among the
Ah.
natives that were forced onto these reservations. And the ones that hadn't been forced on, their resolve was kind of strengthened by this because you can see what's coming.
Right.
Like, you're going to be forced into these internment camps, essentially, and the U.S. government's going to be just going to be your overlord. So, this is where we're going to get our major battles, where we get heavy casualties on both sides or major massacres in the extremes. Most notably, we get the Battle of Little Bighorn,
Right.
where George Custer tried to attack a group of natives while they're, if I remember correctly, he tried to attack a native village while their men were out hunting, approached, and the men were actually setting up an ambush, and Custer was completely, he and his force were completely wiped out.
Wow.
So the natives were learning. It did not go well for the U.S. Army here. It was a major propaganda point back home for people that did not like the wars in the West right now.
Mm-hmm.
Major propaganda point, and it was not popular with anyone. You had people in Congress calling for investigative committee, trying to find out what the U.S. Army is doing, where the money's going, who's organizing it, how terrible this is, that we're throwing all this money at it, and we just lost an entire cavalry regiment.
Wow.
Or not regiment, I don't know the technical term.
I did want to mention, Ryan, that I was at that battleground, and I've been to a few battlegrounds, Civil War battlegrounds and so forth, thanks to Mickey there. And I was at Little Bighorn, that battleground, and I had a different experience there than I've had anywhere else, which is that, I don't know how to explain it. It felt like the ghosts were still there or something. Like the place felt bad to me when I visited it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's how a lot of these places feel. If you're in Kansas or Oklahoma, there are quite a lot of places similar to this, not of the scale, but just in what happened.
Yeah.
And it carries with it about the same feeling.
Right.
And that's not just for people that are descended from settlers. The natives themselves don't necessarily get great feelings from this either, from what I've heard.
Right.
And I've worked with people that are on reservations before. You get a lot of stories from them. These battles are not good for anyone. Even after they've happened, you still get bad feelings when you're there. Just to kind of emphasize the point. So major battles. The U.S. government starts losing a lot more.
I'm sorry, but I'm lost on the calendar here. What period?
Calendar.
When was the Little Bighorn?
Okay, so
battle, for example.
I can
look.
I don't remember the exact date of Little Bighorn, but we're nearing the end of kind of like the time here. Like this, we're nearing the end. These are kind of the death throes of the natives. Tell me when you get that
Battle of Little
date.
Bighorn is, it says it goes over 2 days. June 25th to 26th, 1876.
Yeah, so we're post-Reconstruction, and we're about to be out of the Indian Wars because this is kind of like the last hurrah of the natives.
Got it.
So, like I said, this caused backlash back at home. Multiple Union generals from the Civil War of fame or notoriety started advocating for total extermination. And I believe just preceding all of this, William Tecumseh Sherman, notable for his march through Georgia, total war policy, kind of wrote the book for a lot of Union strategies during and after the Civil War. He advocated for complete extermination of the natives, just to kind of get rid of them and don't have to worry about them. They were ignored, thankfully, but this is kind of where the U.S. Army High Command is at right now. So
I'm sorry, I had heard that about Sherman, Ryan, but was this like in a little private letter to a friend, or was he advocating publicly for genocide?
Both. So Sherman didn't have like a major political platform, so it wasn't like he was getting up onto stages and grandstanding that we need to go exterminate the natives.
Yeah.
It was more he was writing to people that they should be completely exterminated, and anytime a officer or the government asked his opinion, that was the one he would give.
Got it. Okay.
So, like, consultation, letters, conversation. It's his position now, and other Union generals that had still survived up until this point. I'm not going to list them. They aren't necessarily important. It would be very dry. So, the U.S. government intensified its efforts, and this kind of brings an end to the period of warfare, or really heavy warfare, rather. You're still going to have low-level insurrections and resistance, but for now, most of the large-scale battles are done. So this battle, or these series of battles, Little Bighorn, the tribes trying to leave their reservation, tribes trying to take over their reservations, it inspires tribes down in Texas to have their own little uprisings. This is particularly of note because the Texan natives had been subdued since about 1845, so decades ago. And they had been under a similar system that the Texan government had organized. And now, seeing all this happen, they rise up as well. They're put down. It doesn't work, but this is kind of just how far-reaching all of this stuff is. Like, a conflict up in Montana or over in Utah is causing insurrection in Texas. Like, this is it's wide-reaching. So, now, the federal government wins all of this. The natives, by and large, are forced onto reservations, except for cases that are like 1 or 2 cases. So, how is the federal government going to keep a handle on these natives? If you go to the next slide, we'll see the government strategy.
Right there. Policy of state reliance.
Yeah. So Grant and his successors, they kind of worked out that if the natives have to rely on the federal government for everything, then they can't rebel against the federal government. They'll be kind of under their thumb forever. So, what does this translate into? Well, bison were very important to natives. They were the food source. They were the reason that they were still nomadic until the 1800s. They were part of their religions. They were sometimes they were part of tribal organization. So what does the U.S. government do? They subsidize the hunting of bison to the point where in 1884, its population dropped to 325, very near extinction.
Wow.
This has become kind of like a pop history talking point, and it's the reason that I was hesitant to bring it up here, but it's a very important part.
Yeah.
What people get wrong is you will usually see kind of like lefty news sources saying that the people that killed the bison were these multi-millionaires traveling across on railroads, sniping out the window with guns that they would bring, and just leaving them there to rot. That's not where most of the bison population decline came from. The main impact on that was the fact that the U.S. government was quite literally paying people to kill them on a sort of bounty system.
Right. It was a government program of bison extermination.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And so, and here's the upside to this: the individuals, people acting on their own, the free market, if you will. It saves this entire nation. A group of ranchers, completely separated from all this. They were just ranchers out on the countryside. They realized that bison was their bison population was dangerously dwindling. So they herded them onto their ranches and saved them from extinction.
Wow.
Because they didn't want it. So that's the reason we still have them today. If you stone, you'll see them, thankfully, kind of. Just because these few ranchers decided they wanted to keep them alive.
We actually have a state park near here, Lone Elk State Park, that has some bison. And yeah, I mean, when you drive through, there's no separation between you and them. I mean, they don't tend to charge cars or whatever, but you're just looking across the field and there they are. So yeah, it's pretty cool.
Right. And something else, if you roll down your window and there's a bison out there, they will typically stick their head in and then leave. But anyways, so Grant's presidency was succeeded by Rutherford B. Hayes. We mentioned him in the last episode. He ended Reconstruction through a very corrupt sort of bargain, if you will. He removed religious oversight of the reservations, so now it's just entirely operated by the federal government. There is no sort of a religious aid or restriction keeping the government from going too far in dealing with the natives. It's all within the hands of Rutherford B. Hayes now, and anyone that succeeds him. So, all the reservations were grouped under something called the Federal Indian Agency. That name should give you all you need to know. It has federal in the name and it has agency in the name. You know how this is going to end.
Yeah.
We'll get to that in a second. But just to kind of summarize this, I mentioned earlier, this is kind of like a resurgence of battles. The total casualty count was about 2,000 on the U.S. side dead and 3,000 on the Indian side dead. And you look at that and you say, well, the Indians lost more, so the U.S. Army won. The U.S. Army was predicting a casualty count in the triple-digit range, and they ended up getting to 2,000. So in that sense, in that relative sense, this can be seen as kind of like a U.S. Loss, or at the very least, a very Pyrrhic victory, because they lost about, I don't know, what, 10 to 20 times more people than they were expecting to.
Wow.
It wasn't good for the U.S. Army. And most of the U.S. casualties in that were in combat, because this is just the U.S. Army. This isn't including any settlers or anything like that. Most of the native casualties in that count were actually civilians, because we have those numbers. So this is, if we included U.S. settlers that died in all of these things, it might equal out a little bit more, and you can kind of see just how much of a botched experiment this was by the U.S. Army. So, we have the reservations. The Indians are being dealt with by the U.S. government itself. Now they're at the mercy of the bureaucracy and of the throne in Washington. So, what happens? If we go to the next slide, we'll introduce now progressive policy towards the natives.
Dawes, Curtis, and Burke. Go ahead.
Yes. So, these are the names of 3 acts, and we'll get through them quickly so that you don't have to sit through dry ramblings about legislative action. 1887, that's your time frame. This is when the Dawes Severalty Act was passed. So, on reservations, the natives kept their tribal organization. Like, they kept their family structures. Their governments were modified to be democratic and representative, but they had a government of their own.
Mm-hmm.
The Severalty Act gave the president the legal ability to divide tribal ownership into individual allotments. So literally atomizing the tribes and their ownership down to just individuals by just the whim of the president. And here's something else. The federal government, the president, determined who was eligible for this. So if you weren't eligible for this, the government would just take the land. The land they gave you as recompense for taking the land that they took from you earlier. Now they just ruled that they can take that anyways and sell it off to the highest bidder usually. There were a lot of corrupt political deals made along this line. So this led to about 100 million acres of Indian land being lost to the federal government. And it was deemed excess land because the president and the federal government like to use euphemisms. This wasn't, stolen land or land that violated treaties. It was just excess land. So what else this act did was it abolished tribal courts. And it basically abolished multiple treaties that were made with these tribes because it went against just about all of them. So that was 1887. This is kind of like the start of the populist era, kind of getting into like the kernel of the progressive era.
Mm-hmm.
But now we're going to get into the 1898 Curtis Act. So the progressives they just kind of rose to prominence. They're a thing now. This act was actually sponsored by Charles Curtis. You might know him as being the vice president under Herbert Hoover. He himself was half native, and being as he was in the government, he thought that anything he did to the natives would help them because the government helps people. So, what did he do? He abolished tribal ownership, reduced land ownership to individuals, and he put all of this under the authority of something called the Dawes Commission to determine who is a member of the tribe. So, previously, and it makes logical sense, the Cherokee determine who is Cherokee, like their tribe does.
Right.
No one else can tell them that. That's how it is. Well, now the federal government determines who's Cherokee, who's Navajo, who's Apache. They determine all of us now.
Wow.
And tribal ownership is gone. It just does not exist as a category. It's illegal. So this got rid of all of that. And since there's no longer competing governments or, tribes doing anything, Oklahoma can now be admitted as a state. And that gives the progressives more votes because Oklahoma, all the settlers that settled it, it was a very progressive-leaning state at the time. And they baked that into its state constitution. So it was a political win all around for everyone in Washington, and it completely destroyed tribal organization as an entity. So, what more can the government do? Well, let me tell you. In 1906, this was the Burke Act. It gave the U.S. government power to determine whether natives were competent and capable before giving them the ability to own land. So now, as a native, you've had your tribe completely abolished. You've been forced onto these reservations, long ways away from home. The land that the government said they would give you has been confiscated, and you've been given a small sliver of it. And now you are presumed incompetent and incapable until the government rules you to be so. And if you fail to pass the government's check, which was very arbitrary, you just get the rest of that land taken from you, and you're left with nothing, and you're on the reservation. So, this is the quintessential progressive law, because it wasn't a punishing act. That's not the intentions of the people that wrote it. It wasn't meant to be like a hammer to hit over the head of the natives. It was seen as they genuinely thought that natives were mentally incompetent. They did multiple empirical studies at the time to try to prove it, and this is what the law was based off of.
So this was science, right?
Yes, this was a very scientific law at the time, and it was hailed as that way. This was under the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, just to give you an idea. The progressive president. It was kind of the way this was marketed back in the East and the West Coast was this is the new era of scientific lawmaking, because now the natives have to prove that they're competent. And how do we prove they're competent? Well, we've got science to help us. So
trust the science.
The worst part of this act, though, if you did get ruled competent and capable, you are now subject to any taxes that the U.S. government puts on this land in particular. And the U.S. government does not have to tell you about this. It does not have to tell you it's a thing. It doesn't have to tell you what taxes they are. It doesn't have to inform you about any of this. You have to pay taxes for the land they gave you or might have taken from you. And if you fail to pay that tax, it'll just take the land again. So, this is what we're dealing with out west. Now, here's the other part to it. That's the land and tribal organization, completely destroyed, divided up, atomized. What about social organization? What was left? Well, the state forced its own education system onto the Native Americans, and we'll get to that in the next slide here.
Oh, sorry. I jumped to the next slide. Stay on Dawes, Curtis, and Burke, right?
No. Go to the next slide.
Oh, okay. Go ahead. Forced state education.
Yeah, so natives, now by law, had to attend the state education system that was provided for them by the government. These were largely organized and imposed by reservation managers. So it's not like Roosevelt was in Washington and was deciding this school's going to go here in this county and these people are going to go to it. It was on a local level, and as you might know with bureaucracy, with these types of governments, that's where you tend to get like petty tyrants. This is what happened. So these schools, just before we get into the quality, they had an exceedingly high mortality rate. That is, people were dying in these schools at a very high rate.
Hmm.
They had very little in the way of medicine on hand. There were a lot of exposures to these diseases because now we're in the age of global travel. A lot of these people could come from, it's not just the widespreading smallpox anymore. It could be anything on the earth coming back to these schools, and that's what happened. There were oftentimes food shortages because food was being provided by the government. The buildings were in disrepair. They weren't maintained. They were public buildings. And the curriculum, which we're going to get to now, was quite terrible. So that's just the physical state of things. These places are death traps. The curriculum, it relied heavily on corporal punishment to enforce assimilation. They aren't learning like academic subjects in these schools. They are being forcefully assimilated, and if they don't, they get beaten. So this is what we're dealing with. In regards to if it succeeded in that goal or not, it didn't. What it did was it created a highly militaristic native population, and it didn't really create any new Americans. The only reason that these were still functioning for most of the time that they were implemented was because photography became a very new propaganda method. So what the school managers would do, I don't think they were called principals. I might be mistaken though. They would take a photo of the natives being sent into the class for the first time, and a photo of them on their last day in there, when they're dressed up into suits, had their hair parted, didn't have their headdresses, and they would send it back home, and they'd say, "Look, we're transforming these natives into proper Americans, and
Right.
so we can get more money from here, and it'll look good in the papers, so we won't get shut down because people don't have to know that people are dying here." So it was a very good propaganda. It was sustained by propaganda. It was a very effective means of doing this because these started to get implemented in about 1880 or so. And these wouldn't be shut down until about the 1930s,
Hmm.
or I should say the late 1920s, because I believe it was 1928. Herbert Hoover commissioned the Brookings Institute to make a full report on this and publicize it because he thought it would be a good administrative victory for his recent election. It was not. It's one of the many mistakes that Herbert Hoover made in being a politician. The Brookings Institute published these. Public opinion soured very heavily.
Hmm.
So the way the government tried to fix this, as it does all things, was to just throw more money at it. It didn't work. Most of these were eventually shut down. Some of these went until the 1960s. They were eventually shut down. Most of them are museums now. Like I don't think any are still operable in the same way that you would recognize them in these pictures. I think a couple got converted into like public schools,
Mm-hmm.
but this is what forced state education looks like, which is very topical in terms of
Yeah.
homeschooling and
Yeah. Well,
public
actually, I
education.
just wanted to
If you,
mention, because of having an interest in homeschooling and the history of state education in the United States, I happen to know that uh, it would be anachronistic to think that like everybody was doing this across the United States and they were just bringing to the natives what was being done with everyone else. I don't think that's quite right if I remember my timelines. Um, government schooling hadn't really started till like the 1830s in Massachusetts, is what I recall. I may be getting that wrong, but
right.
it was a while before it became what all of us have grown up with, which is just that there's these government schools everywhere, and it's normal for most people to go, and it's weird to not go. That was not necessarily the case in the 19th century. So I think what happened
Right.
here with the Indians might well have been kind of out ahead a bit of where the rest of the country was in being forced into these government schools.
Well, yes, and the only reason, or I should say, the reason that this lasted so long was because it was not normal. No American at this point had been forced into a state educational facility.
Mm.
There had always been other options, or you could just not go. Most people
Hmm.
just didn't go. They were farmers or
Right.
manufacturers, merchants who learned from their family. They weren't necessarily necessary. It wasn't a credentialist system like we have today.
Right.
So whenever the news finally broke in the late 1920s that this is what was happening, it was kind of like is this real? Like it was a shock to most people, because the idea that the state was forcing these natives, or these people rather, because this is the 20s, like these places are inhabited now. The idea that the federal government was forcing these natives into state education facilities and killing them, beating them, assimilating them, giving them no actual knowledge, it was a major scandal. And this is
Okay.
one of the first major scandals of Herbert Hoover's administration, even though most of this was not his fault. He inherited all of this and took all of the brunt for it.
Wow.
So,
And it had
like,
been
this
there.
is
It had been there for
this is
decades
just
and
how
decades.
politics work.
Yeah. Hey,
Yep.
real quick, Ryan.
Yep. And it was a
Go ahead.
yeah. No, I was.
Clausington has an interesting comment here. He says, "I actually gave tours of one of these Indian schools as a teen. The mortality rate was awful."
Yeah. So, where I lived in Oklahoma, it was, or I say where, because I'm in college now, but where I lived, it was about a 10-minute drive north, and you could come across one of these schools, and it was almost stereotypically like movie setting evil. Like they had like the iron bars out in front of it. The roads were run down. It was a gray building, and then inside it's a museum, and it's basically just like, these are the people that died here because the federal
Wow.
government was too neglectful to actually keep them alive while they were forcing them into all of this. If you're in an area to visit one of these, I would highly recommend it, because this is what it's going to look like if they do abolish homeschooling and private schooling. This is what you're left with, just on a softer and more colorful scale than it is in the black and white photographs.
Right.
So, on the next slide, we'll kind of
seeing
see how the natives respond
dancing
to all of this.
They're dancing or something?
Yes, you are.
Okay.
That's exactly it. So this is the ghost dance movement.
So I thought you were going to tell us. I thought this was the happy ending where everybody gets along and they're just dancing and things are good now, right?
I wish. This is probably going to be one of our darker episodes, just in terms of how it all ends. So if you're a native and you say you're born in 1840, okay, you live through all of the warfare, you get forced onto a reservation, your elders die off from disease, the government forces away your tribal organization, or at least severely dilutes it. You're now being sent to these state-mandated schools. You're getting beaten every day. It's apocalypse. This is kind of like their version of the Book of Revelation. These people have come. They've taken their land. They've destroyed their families. They're beating them daily. They're starving them. Their elders have died of disease. Apocalypse. Like that should be the word that comes to mind to most people. So how do you react to this? Just on like a psychological level? Well, they've tried fighting this and it didn't work. Like they've tried that multiple times. They probably had, I don't know how many like insurrections they might have had. And it's in the high double digits. So now they're kind of in like what modern parlance would call the cope stage, if you will. That it's kind of desensitized. Like this is legitimately like they are psychologically coping with all this happening. They called him a prophet in the north part of the country. I forget his name, but he's not really known that much. The name that gets the attention is the ghost dance movement. So it was believed with a lot of these natives and their religions, all but the Navajo, I believe. I think they're the only ones that didn't adopt this. If you did these rituals, then it would resurrect the dead natives, and they could have enough numbers and strength to take back their lands and finally return home from exile and, just live as they were. And it would resurrect the buffalo. That was the other side, or the bison.
Okay.
So it was a two-part: resurrect the natives, resurrect the bison. life could go back to normal.
Right.
They could retake their homeland,
Yeah.
and all they had to do was dance, and
They could live as they had once lived, basically.
yes, exactly. So
Yeah.
The U.S. Army caught wind of this, and if you've seen how this goes, it doesn't look too peaceful. Like, it is very energetic, a lot of yelling, a lot of like movement. It doesn't look like a peaceful organization, just to give the army the benefit of the doubt when I by no means should. So they get wind of this, they have to start monitoring it by federal policy, and they begin confiscating native weapons, because the army's kind of wisened up to this. They think this might be the pretext for another insurrection. The Lakota refused to comply to this order. They kept their weapons, and this turned into a battle, or a massacre rather. And the guy that started it was half deaf, and there's a dispute as to whether or not he did this as like a last stand kind of gesture, or if he just didn't hear the orders of the officer. It turned into an argument because he's deaf. They're yelling. One of the the army soldiers thought that an altercation was happening, so he opens fire, and the natives, half of them had given up their weapons. They're kind of backed into a river. It becomes a massacre, and it becomes known as the Wounded Knee Massacre. So this is like the last straw for the army enforcing just brutal order. This immediately spread like wildfire throughout the nation, and this is where you kind of start seeing federal welfare take the place of the federal army in terms of keeping natives on the reservations, especially now that they don't really own anything. So the army sent home. The U.S. government throws more money at them for reimbursement. They're left owning nothing. They're being forced into state schools. They aren't happy. They aren't owning nothing, and they aren't happy. So, what's the logical outcome of all this? Is as people that have studied what federal welfare will do to family structures. Well, if you go into the next slide, we can get into this, and it still continues to this day. It's not pretty.
Yep.
So,
yeah, social problems is the slide we're on now.
Yep. So, about one generation after the reservations, so like the generation that had never seen the homeland, had the soil attachment to this is where my tribe has been for however long. This is where we start getting a lot of the issues socially. So alcoholism immediately became rampant. It was because a lot of the federal officers tried to ban it on the reservations because they viewed it as inhibiting assimilation progress. Because if the natives are drunk, they aren't assimilating, they're rowdy. They're basically taking care of children at that point because they're the way that alcohol works, if you haven't been exposed to it before, it is very powerful. A lot of them were passed out in the streets, babbling. It's rampant alcoholism, and there's a lot of money to be made on the black market. So that's what happened here. A lot of the reservations were plagued by extreme drunkenness. As we mentioned earlier, tribal organization was completely destroyed. Disease was widespread. Starvation was also widespread. And the government's throwing money at these people to kind of make them self-sufficient on an atomic scale. So family structures completely dissolved. Extended families became virtually non-existent. And, there are a lot of natives that died in these insurrections. You've completely destroyed the family structure, and you've basically carried out what Ulysses S. Grant tried to do in making a policy of state reliance. Because after this generation, and the reason you haven't heard of like giant reservation uprisings is because they are completely dependent on the federal government. It was an aggressive and hostile welfare strategy, and now they're kept there, and they weren't taken care of. So, because of course they're not. Alcohol, tobacco was another one that permeated throughout all of the reservations. A lot of them didn't know how to handle money in the way that it was being given to them by the federal government, because why should they? Like that wasn't That wasn't how they organized. They were a bartering society. So
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes they would go into debt gambling, buying tobacco. They would go into debt with prostitution sometimes. So a lot of these things, you would kind of liken it to the deaths by despair that was kind of talked about a couple of years ago, where you have a lot of the native or the white native population in the U.S. dying by alcoholism, drug overdose, things like that. This is what you're seeing on the reservations about a century prior to what's going on now. So religiously, the missionaries, and this not for a lack of effort, they did a very poor job at actually converting the natives.
Mm-hmm.
Some tribes it worked great. Some of them adopted it wholesale, and they're very faithful people. Most of them did not, because as we mentioned with the school system, the way that they were told to adopt things was through beatings if they did not. So they're very much using the stick strategy. That's not how you spread faith, especially if you're a Christian. You know that faith comes through the word,
Right.
not through the sword. So what this ended up doing, instead of making Christian natives, was that it created kind of like a half-native, half-Christian syncretic religion that still kind of continues to this day. Like, they're essentially polytheists who think that the Christian God is just a different kind of spirit. It didn't work on the religious front. Now, here's another thing: unemployment on these reservations. It will range anywhere from 20% to 80%. And that 80% isn't just the Great Depression. It will oscillate quite a lot throughout the past century and 20 years or so. And you can tie a lot of the unemployment rate, or the unwillingness to seek work, just to the fact that the government's throwing money at them and is basically completely destroying their social organization. So all of this comes together. The native reservations are some of, if not the most impoverished areas in the country, rather.
Yeah.
And you can liken this to kind of like the white Appalachians about a century ago. That's kind of like the level of poverty that you're dealing with. So this is kind of just what you're left with. This is the result of enforcing state reliance and kind of just completely destroying social organization of these people.
Right, and thus we decided we should bring it to everybody with the Great Society programs under Lyndon Baines Johnson.
Yes.
I did want to mention, I'd mention it to you that I visited a tribe, went out west with my family when I was young, and somehow, I don't think we knew them before. Anyway, my dad was a pastor, so we would just somehow meet other Christian missionaries and pastors all the time, or either know them already or somehow just bump into them. Anyway, so we ended up at a reservation, if I remember correctly, visiting with someone, a Christian pastor or missionary who was working there. And those folks told us that the alcoholism in that tribe was 100% of the men. All the men were basically diagnosed alcoholics. So just try to imagine the effect on a culture of that kind of substance abuse or addiction. And
unfortunately, that's not an extreme example. That's common for just the history since reservation systems. Like a 100% alcohol rate among the men that's normal, if you will. And if not 100%, then at least 80, 90. Like, it's very rare to find a native family, for just because of what's happened to them, that doesn't have, can't go back into its lineage and trace alcoholism back to the reservation system.
Right.
So, and you might say, well, they had access to European trade beforehand. Why weren't they alcoholics when they were still on their homelands? Well, the good thing about having your own familial and tribal organization is that it self-regulates. And you had a lot of tribal elders that would severely limit the amount of alcohol intake that natives could have. Natives just genetically weren't accustomed to alcohol. It wasn't, a major thing of theirs, especially not in the strength that was brought over by the Europeans. It was heavily regulated by the tribes. When the tribe and the families are gone, there's no self-regulation there, very little, and they don't even have a major religion to regulate them, any sort of underlying philosophy, because that was botched as well. They have literally nothing preventing them. It's what happens. They resorted to alcoholism. So it's just what happened. And you can apply that to tobacco. Later on in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, you can apply that to drug use. That's an ongoing problem as well today. All of this goes back to the fact of that Ulysses S. Grant, over 100 years ago, decided that his native policy was going to force them to rely on the federal government. Like, you can trace all of this back to him.
Right. So similarly to the story we told in the last chapter in our Road to Empire, in terms of Southern Reconstruction, this is not just something that happened back then and nobody remembers anymore. It is the ongoing effects of the war on the Indians, the federal government welfare state, basically, for the Indians. This is continuing to have an impact on Native Americans to this day. Absolutely.
Yes.
They didn't get over it. It isn't just in the past anymore.
Yeah. This isn't just some it's not like, 30 years ago it was a big problem. It is right now it is still a very big problem, and you have a lot of initiatives. Thankfully, actual private citizens, individuals, organizations have recognized this, have recognized the damage that the U.S. government has done, and have taken it into their own hands to try to restore a lot of this. So we'll see if it works or not, because it's still fairly recent. Hopefully it does, because it's a tragedy on the historical, personal, and on the individual scale that this has happened.
So you didn't cover something I was eager to make sure we covered, and that is, what was the motivation for all this? Because one suspects there was somebody was getting rich. Somebody was lining their pocket from these invasions of the Indian lands and dislocations. You talked about it a bit back east, but what about the war on the west?
So, all right. A lot of that land that was confiscated from the natives, a lot of the things that broke treaties, came from railroad companies. It came from major farming organizations as well. Not your family farmer that wants to go start a homestead, but actual incorporated, or not incorporated, but corporate farms. You had a lot of trading monopolies as well, because the way legally that this was set up for a long time, you had to have rights given to you to trade with natives, and you even had that on reservations. So you had these kind of trading monopolies set up to where it was very lucrative to just sell the natives things, because it was you and maybe two other people that were doing it. A lot of business interests, and for the land that wasn't in the middle of these grand projects, like the railroads or the gold mines, it was also just on its own very nice. So if I'm a politician and I'm allocating all of this, I'm going to give it to my political buddy for a favor or because I like him. So there was a lot of political corruption going on in the land distribution.
Right. I just want to mention, Ryan, for those who maybe didn't catch the earlier episodes, and hopefully to encourage you to do that, the railroads in particular are a through line, a theme so far, right?
Yep.
Lincoln was a lawyer for the big railroads, a well-compensated lawyer for the big railroads. And then we talked about railroads in the Reconstruction and some of the scams that happened there. And then once again now, here we are out west, and it's grabbing land and betraying promises made to Indians and so on and so forth for the railroads. So these railroads seem to be, they weren't the only ones, right? But the railroads seem to be a consistent theme that these, and not all, because there's a heroic railroad guy who did not use state subsidies. He did a non-political version of railroads, and I'm forgetting his name. But there were a lot of really corrupt things going on around the railroads in the 19th century.
Yes, and if we continue the series on, it's going to stay that way. It's just those companies are going to branch out into shipping or other things, and we'll get there.
Right. It's the same the same political interest groups, basically, right?
Yeah. So, I promised that I would make something shorter than last time, so the next slide will wrap all this up.
All right. Very
So,
disciplined. Thank you.
so, and now the United States is ready for what I've determined real empire, because they've been operating as one for quite a long time. Up until this
Hmm.
point, we're at about, let's say we cap this off at about 1898, just to pick a date out of the air. So,
Right.
the U.S. government has been operating political, military, and economic occupation in the South they did that for about a decade and a half, and now they've been out west, uh, getting some real experience with hostile natives, concentrating them into locations, camps, reservations, so
Yeah,
that
I
they could
mean, I
effectively
guess we wouldn't
colonize the
call,
land.
I guess we wouldn't, Ryan, call the reservations concentration camps precisely, because when we picture
Right,
concentration camps, there's like a fence around it, right? But
right.
they were certainly relocating and concentrating the natives,
Yes,
to control, to basically to have control, right?
in the very basic, most non-connotated sense of the word, these were concentration camps because their ultimate purpose was take this hostile population, put them all into this one area, and we'll
Yeah,
manage them. So,
right.
like that is what they were. They weren't being shot on a regular basis. They weren't being intentionally
They did.
systematically starved.
They didn't have barbed wire around the
Yep.
reservations,
Yeah,
right?
most of them are. Yeah, most of them you can just walk right into them. Like you
Right.
won't even know you were there until you start seeing that all the buildings look the same.
And
So,
yet, as you pointed out, this was not voluntary. And one
yep,
tribe did try to just up, or did just up and leave, and they were put right back. So it was a sort of like an open air prison or something.
yep,
Yeah.
exactly. That's
Right.
exactly what it is. So, the U.S. government is going to use. So they have the army experience, they have the navy experience, kind of, and they now have the organization experience. They're going to put this into use up until the modern day. Like it's still going today. The lessons that we learned back then are still being used today in order to keep the American Empire running and afloat. So, and also something that might interest all of you, the kind of like a case study, the native families and tribes that were destroyed by federal grants and organization reforms, quote unquote, that data and experience was later used by the United States government in other operations later down the line, where they're going to do the same thing to other people. And we've covered some of that before, but overseas they've done this, and I'm sure that we'll get to that later. Um, Legally, the implications of all this: the executive and the legislative branch have infinitely more power over what are effectively U.S. colonies.
Mm-hmm.
So, overseas territories,
Yeah.
protectorates, administrative regions, puppeted government, or not puppeted, overseen governments. I forget
Yeah.
what the technical term is after World War II, but
Overseas
yeah,
territories and such. Yeah. Okay. You
yeah,
make a really good point here, because it could have gone differently, right? Just as
yeah,
the Spanish scholastics argued that the Native Americans should have been treated as fellow humans and so forth by the Spanish Empire, which I don't think they were. Um,
right,
uh, so also, it could have gone that judicial decisions and so forth were that, you know, we basically, yeah, they're technically not citizens, but we basically have to treat them as people with rights similar to citizens' rights and so forth. And that's not how it went. It ended up just being
exactly.
a executive fiat and so forth, right?
Yep,
And these people are, this is why I think we see some of the effects of this to this day, right? Where they talk about, well, was this on US territory? Was this at Guantanamo Bay? Well, Guantanamo Bay, you can do that to them there, because that's not really US territory, and you're hearing these arguments, you're like, what are they talking about? Well, it's
yeah,
because the US government gets away with certain things depending on the legal status of the people and of the territory, right? They
yep,
have a much
and
they have a much they have a much longer leash under certain circumstances because of all this history.
Yes. So for two things, just at any point in time, Ulysses S. Grant and his yes successors could have been stopped by the legislative branch, could have been stopped by the judiciary, could have been stopped by just the actual army refusing to go along with it, but
Yeah.
they weren't.
Right.
So yeah, it could have gone differently in an infinite number of ways.
Yeah.
The other thing with the Guantanamo Bay Detention Center, the laws that allow that to operate in the manner that it does gets its precedent from the laws in which the United States operated its reservation system. So you were spot on there, and it's not the same laws. Don't confuse that.
Yeah.
But it is the same legal precedent.
Right.
And unless you noticed, it also domestically, so for U.S. citizens not in the overseas empire, there's a lot of power that has been given to the federal government. They've set the precedent if ever they want to just force you into state schools because they've done it before. That's all legal precedent is. Have we done this before? Well, yes, they have. They can set a precedent to where you only can rely on them because they've done it before. They have everything that has just happened to the natives in this show can potentially be in law for you. There is nothing stopping. There is no physical barrier in legal or legislative interpretation or development that is stopping them from doing this to you. That's why a lot of this is important.
Right.
So when someone says, "Would the government really do that?" Well, they have done all.
They have done it. Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So.
So
it's not would they, it's when.
One more bit of segue and setting us up for the next chapter of this. As you show on the screen here, the American flag has not been planted in foreign soil to acquire more territory, but for humanity's sake. So I think as we enter into the empire going overseas, there's a lot of humanitarian nonsense propaganda on top of it, which we've seen even up to the things happening this week, right? How could you leave? Think of the poor Afghanis, that the U.S. empire is leaving them,
Yeah. The women.
So we know that the humanitarian bullshit basically is laid over the U.S. empire as it's overseas. You've talked about it a little, but could you summarize a bit how much of that is happening with the Indians? Is this something that's consistent? Is this something that happens sort of as we get closer to the end of the 19th century?
I mentioned earlier that a lot of Grant's rhetoric was centered around civilizing and progress for the natives' own sake. And
it's for their good.
Even earlier than that, Jackson sent them across the Mississippi for their own good. It is a theme. It has never not been employed. As soon as day one, the United States sets up its foreign policy and has to deal with people close to it or that it wants, it is for their own good. This is why we're doing it. They need this. It's for their own good. With the natives, their education system, the assimilation and civilizing policy that was in place that we went over, it was not seen as a militaristic or a cruel practice. It was seen as bringing them into our lovely civilization so that they can better function with us. It's for their own good. Why are we in Afghanistan? Well, it's for their own good, because if we leave, then the evil Taliban's going to take over. Yeah.
So before there was a global democratic revolution, where we're going to bring our wonderful ways to everybody all over the world, there was a sort of continental democratic revolution, right? We're going to bring civilization, democracy, whatever you want to call it. We're going to bring our ways, our political ways and so forth. And we're going to shove them down the throat of these natives and turn them into us, basically, right? We're going to make them into, the Borg will absorb, right? we're going to turn them into us by sticking them in these schools, Christianizing them by force, educating them by force, whatever, right? We're going to shove all this down their throat. And you're saying this rhetoric of it's for their own good. It's a humanitarian rhetoric. Is maybe it's a little anachronistic to use that term, humanitarian, but what we would call humanitarian rhetoric today, you're saying that's always there
Actually,
with
I'll do
these
you
state
one
actions.
better.
Yeah.
With the natives, it does become literally humanitarian because that's what the progressives campaigned on, was
Mm.
humanitarian treatment. And as we saw, what their humanitarian treatment looked like was scientifically determining who was capable and who was not, and who got to own land. Um, so this goes back to the progressive era in terms of humanitarianism, and in terms of for their own good. It goes all the way back to Jackson and people preceding him. So this is just how the U.S. empire operates from day one until the modern day today, and this is what happens. We've shown you the South, we've shown you the natives, and we'll show you more.
Right. Okay. So I hope we've convincingly presented the case that this story, this tragic story here, is part of what you need to understand. I like what I said on Twitter. It's part of the origin story of the U.S.
Yes.
empire. If you want to understand the very next thing that happens, the Spanish-American War, which is our next thing to talk about, if you want to understand the Spanish-American War, and for that matter, all the way up to what just the disaster of the occupation of Afghanistan, understand this, because this
Yep.
is, like you said, putting legal precedents in place. It's literally creating the personnel that execute the next chapter, right? There's a
Yep.
what do you call it? There's a cultural or oral kind of history kind of thing that happens, right? Where,
Mm-hmm.
well, this is what we did with the Indians, so this is what we'll do with the Filipinos or whatever, right? I mean, so
Yep.
these
Precedent.
practices
Yes.
actually get passed down from person to person to some degree, right? As the
Yes.
U.S. empire unfolds across the world. But the seeds are right here on the North American continent first, in the South
Yes.
and in the West.
And if I may add to that, it's not like
Yeah.
historicism where we're pointing to the past and saying, well, it has to unfold this way. No, we're saying if you see what's happening today, look at it, just the things that have just happened, and you go back and look at this, you're going to see some striking parallels.
Yeah.
And, just the way trends work logically, you can kind of predict what's going to happen next to a capacity. Just, from knowing this is what has happened, this is what they do. They have not said they have changed, this is what they're going to do. They have
Right.
not even tried to change what they're going to do. It's the same like cookie cutter template for occupying a people, and they just apply it to everywhere they go.
Right.
It's the American empire.
Right. Yeah. So, right. That's a really good point. Because one of the strange things about propaganda here in the United States is it seems to convince people that, well, yeah, that was in the old days, but now we're more enlightened, we're better, we care more, we're more politically correct, and we're more sensitive to the vulnerable. I mean, whatever, right? I mean, each generation has its own way of convincing itself that it has reached a pinnacle of like goodness and righteousness that
Yeah.
people in the past, those terrible people in the past, yeah, I know, we know bad things happened back then, but now we're cool, right? Well, what you already said it, but what I always want to ask people is, okay, what was the point at which the pattern of behavior that had been there for a long time, that you acknowledge was there, what was the point at which that changed? Could you tell me the year, the decade? What was the movement or the political change that happened? I mean, seriously, what happened between what we are talking about today and what just happened in Afghanistan? What is the point you can go back to in American history and say, wow, there was really a sea change there? They really decided to change how they deal with other foreign peoples in an occupation or whatever, or they decided
Yeah.
to really swear off empire at that point. There was no point. There is no
Nope.
point in American history where there was a sharp turn and we really just, the United States really changed its view about empire, about how to deal with people under occupation and so forth. It's just been one succession of mess after another, basically, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. I don't even think I can add to that. That's just the full picture.
Right. Okay, well, let's hit some super chats, Ryan, and thank you. Obviously, this was a heavy Ryan Turnipseed episode today, and thank you so much for your preparation. And of course, you're taking advantage of your good fortune of having being in Oklahoma, where, as we saw, that those things that are the Indian lands on that early map. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Let's go back to here. Yeah, make a make us bigger and get rid of the slides for now. Um, that early map that showed the Indian lands that the 5 civilized tribes were getting shipped over to, isn't that? It looked like it was mostly Oklahoma, or what was it?
That is Oklahoma minus the Panhandle.
Okay, so Oklahoma
Literally
is
just
basically
Oklahoma.
what was at one time on the map labeled as the Indian lands, later became a state, the state of Oklahoma, and became part of the Union. But for a while there, it was just going to be the place where the Indians were, and not necessarily a state, I guess. Right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Yeah. So you are literally in the right place to talk about this and to have learned about this history.
Yeah, I am. Yeah, and there are a lot of people here that just have different kind of different stories about it that have been passed down, and there are people still living and to deal with a lot of this because left out because I was trying to keep it short and simple. FDR kind of reinstated, quote unquote, reinstated tribal organization. That's within living memory of some of people over here. It wasn't the actual tribes. It was a very artificial and democratic, non-native system. Don't confuse yourself. But like this story is still playing out today, and I've listened to it. So.
Okay, yeah, excellent background. Thank you for sharing this. I mean, it's a tragic tale, but I feel like it is. I've been really convicted by Solzhenitsyn in particular. A passage from Gulag Archipelago I'll have to share sometime. I shared it at church once. I was really convicted that sometimes simply bearing witness has value. You know, simply
Yes.
to remember things that others would like to forget. Right? There's value to it.
Yes.
Unto itself. So I think it's an important story. Okay, I usually start with Subscribestar tips because I want to encourage people onto Subscribestar. More of the money that you give us gets to us on Subscribestar. But we've got a really mega comment on there that might take us a while to discuss, and I don't have that much time. So let's do the YouTube Super Chats, which will be quicker. Mickey the Fourth, just a small one since I'm too lazy to load Subscribestar. Thank you, Mickey. Jedi Knight Anakin Cringewalker, 2 from him. First, I've heard Roosevelt's state parks, this would be Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt state parks were secretly to kick natives off the land. Does that sound?
Does not.
That sounds a little late. What do you think?
Well, no, because
okay.
So some places, if you remember that map way earlier in the episode, that was like the reservation systems over time, green and yellow and all that, and they divide the U.S. into east, and then it had all the different kind of territorial organizations. Some native reservations were kind of like in the Yellowstone region, if you will, that kind of area. So Teddy Roosevelt comes along. It's a great way to get into the federal government's hands, Indian land, if you say it's for a good cause, like national park system. So, which is I visited Yellowstone recently, and that issue in of itself has become something that I've been thinking about quite a lot. State ownership of natural resources and natural life. It's particularly inefficient. So the idea that Teddy Roosevelt, the guy that started the whole craze and the whole system, would do something like this is not at all surprising.
Isn't there a thing about Mount Rushmore, which is itself, of course, in a state park?
Yes.
Isn't that wasn't that like an Indian mountain or something? And some people are pretty unhappy that they carved presidents' faces in it.
Yes. Yeah, not just like an Indian mountain, but it had like particular spiritual importance for that tribe. Yes.
Right. Okay, so yeah, he is on to something with that. And then his other comment was just, great work, folks. And that's mostly to Ryan's credit, so thank you, Ryan. Okay, then one more, but it's not a small one. Okay. In fact...
If I may, before we go on, I would like to thank our graphics designer because I
Yeah.
quite irresponsibly threw my PowerPoint at him late last night,
Oh,
and he
you
did a
did?
lot of amazing. Yeah, he did a lot of amazing touch-up work on it. Really made it look professional.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he does a great job.
I didn't know that. Thank you to Andrew, our graphic designer. And we're going to get these credits working again probably when I get a new machine, and we'll be seeing him and our producer credited each time. Okay, so let me read this. Yeah, I didn't know he helped you. That's fabulous. So, and anywhere, somewhere. By the way, another benefit of Subscribestar is he gave us $2 on Subscribestar as a tip. You have to be a subscriber to do this, but he gave us $2 as a tip on top of whatever his usual donation is each month. And then he sent like a massive bulky paragraph that I'm going to read to you. As you know, on YouTube, they kind of almost make you pay by the letter. Well, Subscribestar seems to be a little more generous on the limits. So another motivation for people who want to say a bit more to us. Okay, topic unrelated. So now we're going off to something else. But this week, several things occurred that got the cogs turning. Bank restrictions seem to be increasing everywhere. My personal bank now verifies all places I send money to. And if they aren't verified, they restrict the payment to £1,000 a day. And even if they are verified, they are restricted to a maximum of £20,000 per day. That was my personal account, but my boss told me today he's been having the same issues with the company business account, flat out canceling payments and not notifying him. This is now starting to be tied to biometrics. My bank's saying I can bypass the £1,000 limit if I add biometrics to my account. While I don't think this is a topic in and of itself, chin scratching on this over tea break had me wondering, are they baking into the system the inability to shift capital around quickly enough to cause a digital bank run? Okay, right. So I slot this under the war on cash, which is a topic that we have kept an eye on this show. In fact, we had one episode that had war on cash in the title, I think. War on cash and negative interest rate, something like that. So that's one to go back to if you're of interest to this. People at the Mises Institute, I'm thinking of Joe Salerno, but many others, have been very interested in this topic of the war on cash. More and more restrictions, just like you're describing. More and more restrictions on, say, how big of cash bills there can be. So they'll just get, there used to be in the United States, as I'm sure you know, Turnip, from knowing history and stuff, there used to be like a $5,000 bill and a $10,000 bill. Crazy stuff like this, right? They're just literally eliminating some of those bigger bills. So you can't do it in cash. And then you can't do it digitally at the bank because they have these caps that he's describing. Go ahead.
And if I can add on to this, just from just what I've witnessed in the past week, I think a lot of cashless systems are kind of being experimented with on university campuses as kind of like a microcosm, if you will, for if it gets implemented later, because all of the transactions that I have come across and seen so far have been completely non-physical. It's all been digital on a card. Not even like a dollar or a penny in sight. It is all just digital. Like it's a university campus like this, and I'm sure this isn't the only one, would be a great place if I am in the government or part of the World Economic Forum. These places, these university campuses are great to test out any experiment they want to run just with a group of people that can't really do much in return.
Right. In a little mini economy where people are buying food and kind of doing sort of things more or less like you do in the regular economy, but you can just say everybody has to do it like this now, right?
Yes.
We have to have your thumbprint or your face ID before we let you buy a burger, or whatever.
Yeah.
This is a huge issue. And then he threw in one more thought at the end, and I'm not sure I'm ready to totally discuss it. It's very interesting thought. I'm wondering too. He says the point is to avoid a digital bank run. That is, get it to the point where it's too restricted for everybody to come and pull enough out to reveal the weakness of the bank, right? Because that's what a
Yeah,
bank run
exactly.
does. It reveals that the bank does not have the backing that you think it does, because everybody comes and says, "Where's the cash I entrusted to you?" And eventually the bank says, "Sorry, we really don't have it," right? Well,
Yep.
if they restrict you to a small enough amount of money that you can withdraw in a day, everybody can go withdraw that much, and the bank could maybe survive a bank run, right?
Right. I remember like when I was in like 7th grade or something, my introduction to just economics as like an idea, like
Mm,
really young, hadn't come across it before, was Milton Friedman's Free to Choose series. I know
yeah,
you Chicago
good
school,
stuff.
but
Yeah.
um, his little section on bank runs and the Great Depression, the way in his Chicagoite framework to solve that is literally to just restrict the amount of cash going out of the bank by taking as long as possible to dole out money to the people running on the bank. Like this has been a strategy before. It's just they've never put like a hard formal cap saying you cannot withdraw this much.
So I'm sorry.
Before it was just like a
This was Milton Friedman. Let's be fair to him. Austrians are critical of him
mhm.
in certain regards. Let's be fair to him. In many cases, most cases, he took sort of the pro-liberty position, against
Yes.
the minimum wage laws and so many.
Yep.
He took so many sound positions. Was he against this slow walk of withdrawals, or was he proposing it?
I'm not saying either. He
Oh, okay.
definitely I don't think he was against it though, because just the
Uh,
his like how do you deal with bank runs? Well, instead of saying, well, people if they value like a bank integrity or something like that, they'll just go to a full reserve bank or whatnot. His solution was, oh well, banks should just take as long as possible to dole out
hmm.
money so that the panic dies down and you can't run the bank anymore.
Right.
So it
So
seems.
this is a huge difference, right, between the Austrian school and the Chicago school.
Mhm.
People on the outside tend to think that they're just extremely similar. They're both like free market schools or pro-capitalist or whatever.
Mhm.
But if when you get into the details, you find that there are some intense differences, and one of them has to do with like fractional reserve banking, which
Yes.
most, not all, by the way, but most Austrians, certainly the Mises Institute, generally would be very much against fractional reserve banking. And it's fractional reserve banking that results in bank runs being such a scary thing. If you have
Yeah.
reserves for everything, if you have the reserves, in my view, that you should, then everybody comes to get their money and they're able to get it. And then they're
Yeah.
like, okay, well, okay, now you can have it back because I trust you now, right?
Right.
But in a fractional reserve banking scenario, they don't have your money. They have some small percentage of everybody's money. And so if everybody
Yep.
comes and asks, they go under. Friedman was not opposed to this. Murray Rothbard and many other Austrians are thoroughly opposed to it. So that's one
Yes.
huge difference between the two schools of economics. And there's many, many more, and they go very deep. It's not just that one policy position. And that's why
Unfortunately,
Ron
yeah.
Paul is so clearly an Austrian when he's at a rally back when he was running for president, and students are burning dollar bills and chanting "In the Fed, in the Fed." That's never going to happen at a Friedman event.
Yeah, especially because just recalling back to when I would listen to his talks and all that, he wasn't even against the Fed, just how it was being ran. So I guess it's the basis of a lot of his theory is it presupposes the Federal Reserve exists, just that he can run it. Like one of the many differences, and it vaguely relates to the chat. It's just like even other parts of people that call themselves libertarians aren't like they kind of ushered this along, if you will, not to
Yep.
hearken to uh, anything else in our spheres, but this is just an example where the monetarists kind of this is their theory taken to its logical conclusion. Well, if it's digital, we can't just take a load of time feasibly to get people their things to prevent a bank run. What do? Make it completely digital and put caps,
Yep.
formal caps on money that can go out. It's just
Yeah.
formalizing Friedman's solution.
Right. So anyway, we've been covering this topic on the show. We'll continue to cover it under the themes of the war on cash and central bank digital cryptocurrency. It's just like Bitcoin, kids. It's just you can trust it because it's from the central bank. That's the line they're going to try to shove down our throats any day now, I think. It's coming quite soon. They are
doing it.
definitely playing with it.
Like I've seen headlines already that's like we're making our own cryptocurrency, but it's state backed, so you know it's good.
You know it's awesome. Yeah. Right. Meaning they totally don't get why people like Bitcoin at all.
Exactly.
Okay, anyway, I think we've got everything. Let me do one more check to make sure I didn't miss any super chats or tips that came in right at the end. I don't think so. Yeah, I think we're good there. Good there. Cool. I think we were done. Thank you so much, Ryan. Really excellent. That is what I was hoping for, is to, well, even more than I was thinking about. I was just thinking about sort of precursors to the empire, but you really brought up a whole nother angle, which is that there were precedents for the welfare state.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry. There was a welfare state. It was just at the level of the reservation.
Yep.
They did it on that micro
you'd
scale.
appreciate that. Yeah.
They did that on a micro scale before later rolling it out to all of us. And now we've got welfare dependency all over the place, not just Native Americans and not just Black Americans, by the way. But some people think that Black Americans are tied, know that some poor Black Americans are tied in with the welfare state. It is way beyond Black Americans by now. Let me assure you. I've seen the stats. Yeah. It's everybody. All ethnicities, all over the country. The welfare state has got its tendrils everywhere at this point. It's really a massive aspect of what's going on culturally.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's terrible. Okay, anyway, thank you very much. And I just have to remember what I do at the end. Give me just a sec. Where's my notes? We've been playing with the ending. Okay, and thank you, Ryan, and goodbye to everybody. See you next week for Econ Minis.